Welcome to Confessions in Quarantine, Episode 7. This week, the seventh commandment. Don't steal. Don't do it. It's not a good idea. Don't steal. Like all of Luther's understandings of the commandments, this one seems pretty simple at first, but as we go deeper and deeper into it, we find out that the commandment to steal leads us more to a holistic way of understanding the world around us, about our place in the world, and about how we can live, not just simply through negation, but in positive ways. Hopefully you remember from the first episode, our episode on not making idols, you might remember that we found out that Luther understood money as probably the greatest idol out there, that people would put all of their trust and their hope into money as opposed to anything else, as opposed to the active work of God. So we'll actually find out that that commandment is pretty closely related to this one because both of them are very critical of the use of money and how we use money, how we earn money, and what we do with money. So, as always, let us turn to our handy-dandy Book of Concord. From the Small Catechism on the Seventh Commandment. You are not to steal. Well, what does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we neither take our neighbor's money or property, nor acquire them by using shoddy merchandise or crooked deals, but instead help them to improve and protect their property and their income. We can see from the get-go that this commandment isn't just about the act of stealing. Don't do it. No stealing. It's not good for us. But it's actually also about facilitating and maintaining an economically just system. You see, for Luther, stealing isn't only the act of taking money from someone, as in burglary or in robbery or anything like that, but Luther sees theft as an overall way in which people interact with the market with their own best interests at heart. Luther sees thievery all over. According to Carter Lindberg, one of his favorite quotes, period, one of his favorite proverbs, period, is that the big thieves hang the little thieves. And that line is, I think, a key to understanding his overall view of this commandment. Big thieves hang the little thieves. He actually goes on to say that thievery is the most common craft and the largest guild on earth. He goes on to say that if we were to hang every single thief that we had, especially those who don't admit to being thieves, we would soon find ourselves out of both gallows, ropes, and executioners. The fun thing about what Luther says about those people who don't admit to being thieves is that he means particularly that line, big thieves hang the little thieves. He's not talking about the petty criminals. He's talking about the big dealers. Here's a fun quote. Yes, we might well keep quiet here about the individual petty thieves, since we ought to be attacking the great, powerful arch-thieves, with whom the lords and princes consort, and who daily plunder not just a city or two, but all of Germany. The arch-thieves aren't the little thieves. The arch-thieves are the ones who hang the little thieves. And the difference between a big thief and a little thief is not only scale, but PR. Think of the thieves who go into big box stores, ones like Walmart or Target or whatever, and get away with a few $100s worth of merchandise. But they find themselves arrested and get many years in jail. Perhaps even consider some of the ones who steal medicine for themselves, or perhaps for illicit use or illicit selling, and also get jailed and put away for several years. Those are the petty thieves. Now, don't get me or Luther wrong. These folks are doing something wrong. They should be stopped. That sort of thing shouldn't happen. But is that the most dangerous kind of theft? Consider, with me, and theoretically with Luther as well, as we understand him in the Large Catechism, the Economic Policy Institute's observation that $8 billion a year gets stolen in the 10 most populous states in the United States from 2.4 million workers. That averages out to about $3.3 thousand per worker per year alone in the United States. That is a lot of money. That's way more money than what your average common criminal gets away with. That isn't petty theft. That isn't some scary man walking into a store and taking money from the cash register. No, that's wage theft. Wage theft occurs in a lot of different ways. But usually it involves, well, always it involves laborers doing their work, but not getting paid the way that they're supposed to. Now look, I'm blessed in my life. I'm very fortunate. But I would decidedly notice if $3,300 went missing from me every year. That would not be a good thing. And I make more per year than a lot of folks who work in retail and in per-hour jobs as opposed to a salaried job. Those $3,300 can do an awful lot in someone's household. The report also states that wage theft disproportionately targets and affects women, younger workers, people of color, immigrants, and all sorts of people who are economically more vulnerable. This is one of the ways that economic vulnerability happens. It happens through not paying people what they actually earn. The report goes on to say that people who have all of that money, $3,300 taken away from them every year, those folks are also not investing that $3,300 back into their community. The amount of freedom that amount of money can provide is pretty huge. That's a real big difference in rent, in taxes, in all sorts of things that would go on to help communities. So that is a lot of money that is being taken out not only of individual pockets, but also of a wider community's overall income, especially in places where one particular business or one particular location provides more economic necessity in an area than anything else. The report goes on to note that Pennsylvania, the state in which I live, the state where I'm filming this, actually has one of the worst records on wage theft. And of course we know that there are all sorts of big businesses that become too big to fail, banks and other financial institutions, which can have a really big impact on our wider economy, can commit major economic crimes that hurt a lot of people, including every American taxpayer. And because of their actions, they end up taking a lot of money from us. That, too, is theft. But you really don't hear about too many arrests of wage thieves, do you? Even though they certainly create the most economic distress, even though they create the most economic harm, you don't hear much about them getting arrested, and you often hear about them getting away when you do hear about it. You hear that a lot of them just don't get punished at all, or get a slap on the wrist. A guy can get 5 years for stealing a TV, or 20 years for stealing a TV. But if you steal thousands, millions of dollars from your workers every year, you don't really get punished all that badly in comparison, do you? Beyond that, we've often heard of people accused of theft. We've heard of people calling the police for alleged thieves. And we've heard of them getting shot and killed by both bystanders and by the police. But you never really hear of that for wage thieves, do you? Big thieves hang the little thieves. Once again, from his large catechism, Luther observes that this is the way of the world as fallen in sin. Those who can steal and rob openly are safe and free, unpunished by anyone, even desiring to be honored. Meanwhile, the petty sneak thieves who have committed one offense or the other must bear disgrace and punishment to make the others look respectable and honorable. But they should know that God considers them the greatest thieves, and that he will punish them as they deserve. What style of theft do we really need to be worried about if we're trying to cultivate a life-affirming and just world? Old Man Luther goes on to give a very stern and quite scary warning that I like a lot. I'm going to share that with you now. Beware of how you deal with the poor. There are many of them who must live from hand to mouth, and if you act as if everyone has to live by your favor, if you skin and scrape them right down to the bone, if you arrogantly turn away those who need your aid, they will go away wretched and dejected, and because they can complain to no one else, they will cry out to heaven. Beware of this, I repeat, as if it were the devil himself. Such sighs and cries are no laughing matter, but will have an effect too great for you and all of the world to bear, for they will reach God, who watches over the poor, troubled hearts, and he will not leave them unavenged. You see, the way of the world might indeed be such that the big thieves hang the little thieves. But the way of God is quite different, and the way of God is the way we're called to follow. Of course, Luther doesn't just attack the wealthy or anything like that. Luther has the love of God to go around. Luther, of course, goes against artisans and merchants who create and who sell shoddy merchandise. Consider the things that you buy that are designed to break after a little while, or consider things that are planned to become obsolescent, planned to not work anymore or be compatible anymore after a few years. Luther goes up against domestic workers and farm workers and all sorts of hired labor that he thinks are being lazy or who are being negligent or wasteful in their duties. Luther considers all of these things stealing. He doesn't like any of them. He argues that they're actually worse than the petty sneak thieves because they're creating a relationship built on trust, that they'll get a job done right, and then they're breaking that trust. We can find again that relationship between people, trust and authority. These things are all very important for Luther. We need to keep that in mind to understand this commandment. It's kind of surprising then, isn't it? The people we typically assume and think about when we think about thieves, when we think about stealing, those petty thieves, those criminals who go into stores or anything like that, they're actually the last people that Luther is worried about. So as with Luther's other commandments, there is the negative aspect that we just went over. Don't steal. Just don't do it. It's a bad idea. Try to avoid systems of economic injustice. But also there's the positive understanding of the commandments. And here we find again, to follow the commandment means to help people to improve and protect their property and their income. Now, Luther believes that the church's job isn't strictly to govern, but it is to help guide governance. And Luther himself doesn't really set up a system of government per se, but he does expect the governments to find ways to better restrain evil, to better stop economic injustices from happening. Luther wants governments to figure out how to best regulate trade, commerce, and taxes in their territories so that the poor aren't oppressed or burdened, and so that they might never be tempted to fall into the sin of theft. Luther thinks that this is a government's responsibility to set up and establish a way of life in their territories that makes sure that people don't have an occasion to sin. Luther also very strongly argued not just for civil consequences, but for ecclesial consequences as well. In particular, when he's dealing with people who offer loans with banks and the like, he actually argues that you can't charge more than 5% interest on personal loans, and that those who do charge more than 5% on personal loans should be excommunicated. in individual conduct as well, Luther says that we are really charged with making sure that our neighbors don't get screwed over, that they don't throw their money away, but instead that they have the stuff that they need and that they're taken care of. He goes so far as to say that you should freely lend and freely give to make sure that both friend and foe are protected. So, we know that there are both personal components to following this commandment and also societal components to this. We know that the government has some role in this, and we know that the individual has some role in this. The Lutherans never develop a mandatory system of government, but there are Lutherans in all different kinds of government. Likewise with economic models. Though I think it bears noting that in the governments and states where the Lutheran Reformation became dominant, that is, in the historical cities and regions in which Lutheranism became the dominant religion of the land, we find that these places all have ended up becoming some varying degree of social democracy. Now, we see this primarily, of course, in the Scandinavian states, who generally share a Scandinavian economic model in one sort or another. They're all a little different. We also see this in Germany. There are scholars who argue that social democracy arose in these nations in no small part because of the presence of Lutheranism and the dominance of Lutheranism as the state's religion. Now, we can't exactly say there's a causal effect here. After all, we know that the Church has been on varying sides of different reforms over the years. Some of them were completely on board with major social changes, and some of them were very fiercely resistant. However, generally we agree that 300 to 500 years of consistent Book of Concord teaching should probably get into society's brain when it comes to taking care of those who need us. Now, instead of getting into the models of government that we should use, because frankly I'm not totally qualified for that. I'm not trained in statecraft. I'm trained as a pastor and a theologian and a historian. I think a more fruitful thing for us to do here is to actually understand what the Lutherans did and why they did it. The things that they actually did on the ground. We can look at what actually happened in Germany in the Reformation states. And to do that, I'm going to use my very favorite reformer. Not Luther, not Melanchthon, but the understated third man of the Lutheran Reformation, Johannes Bugenhagen. Bugenhagen was a really fascinating figure. He was an early adopter of the Reformation. After quarreling with Luther a little bit, he was convinced. He came to Wittenberg, and he ended up becoming Luther's pastor and confessor. That alone would be enough to kind of put him into the high vaults of history. But at the same time, if we only had his theological writings and if we only had his sermons, that'd be enough. But what he was best at, and what is least often observed, is that he would actually be the guy who nations, cities, princes, kingdoms, he was the guy they would call so that they could figure out how to govern in a Lutheran way. So Bugenhagen would go to various cities, and he would meet with mayors and city councils. He would go to castles and palaces and meet with princes and kings and their advisors. And he would go just about anywhere he was asked to consult and to help develop city codes after he'd spent some time on the ground getting an overall appraisal of what their financial situation was. And so, in 1528, Johannes Bugenhagen is asked by the city of Braunschweig to write a city code. And he spends 200 pages extolling the values of midwives, of schools, of education for all boys and girls. He talks about prisoners' rights. He talks about worship services. He talks about the right order of the Mass and how often we should gather, and all sorts of things. And most pertinently, he starts arguing for an economic tool called the common chest. So Bugenhagen realized that there was a lot of money that Braunschweig was no longer spending on extra candles, extra masses, more money that they weren't sending down to Rome or paying to monastic orders or beggars or anything like that. Beggars not meaning just the poor, but rather meaning monks who had no money on their own, and it would be argued that if you gave the monk who had no money some money, you would be earning salvation for yourself in a way. Bugenhagen said, no, you're not spending any of your money on that anymore. But instead, we're going to make sure that every civil servant, including the pastors and the bishops, got enough money to live. And beyond that, all that money that you weren't spending on Rome, you should put in a big central community chest. All of that money should go into this community chest, and that money would be distributed in-house. That is, within the city. All of that money would be distributed by a number of select people. Often deacons would determine where that money would go, and it would be going to either the completely poor or the working poor as supplement to their wages when they couldn't make ends meet on their wages alone. The working poor who just didn't have enough to get by but needed a little more. It would go to those who were sick. It would go to those who had lost the use of their limbs due to accidents or illness. It would go to orphans. It would go to widows. It would go to anyone who needed money but didn't have money, who needed food but didn't have food, who needed shelter but didn't have shelter. Anyone who was in need, even foreigners walking through, who needed something, could get something. And in fact, Bugenhagen even argued that when that community chest was running a little bit low or running empty, pastors should actually spend their time in the sermon admonishing people until it was filled up again. Bugenhagen also observed that this in particular was the responsibility of the wealthy of the city. In the order of Braunschweig, this was considered an additional thing. It wasn't really a firm tax, but it was expected for everyone to pay into it so that everybody had enough. So Lutherans don't prescribe a social order or a governmental order or an economic order today. It's not really what we do. It goes kind of against the grain of history in a way. It goes against the grain of the societies in which we already live. It's hard to rewrite history, and it's not entirely possible to rewrite social orders in the same way that it was at the time of the Reformation. But we are called to live in our states and live in our areas and be responsible citizens, to work for the benefit of the city we live in, as the prophet Jeremiah taught. But wherever we go and wherever we find ourselves living, we are called to listen to these guidelines and take them very seriously. We are called to hold society responsible and accountable for what it's meant to do. To establish peace, to maintain justice, and to be a beacon for the world. We'll always have weak points. We'll always have weak spots. We will always have things that go unnoticed, and the church will always be called to address those things. We're always called to do better. But we can be part of that work, and we are part of that work. Because Jesus Christ died and rose for us, and calls us by the power of the Spirit to really wonderful things that take part and please the heart of God. So there's the seventh commandment: don't steal, don't do it, but instead lift up and maintain real economic justice wherever you are and however you can. Next time, we talk about bearing false witness.